There is a version of New York City that most people never see. It exists in the same buildings, breathes the same recycled air, moves through the same lobbies and elevators and gleaming marble corridors. But it runs on a different schedule, enters through different doors, and eats lunch in hallways instead of dining rooms. It is the city that wakes at 5 in the morning to make sure your world looks effortless by 8. Alicia Greco had been living in that version of the city for 8 years. She was 26 years old, and she had learned, somewhere between her first shift and her 100th, that invisibility was not a personal failing. It was a design feature. The hotels and high-rises and catering halls of Manhattan did not overlook people like her by accident. They had refined it into an art form, a careful, practiced erasure that began the moment you put on the uniform and ended only when the uniform came off. You could spend an entire 8-hour shift in a building full of extraordinary wealth and not be looked at once. Not at your face, anyway. At your cart, sometimes. At the streak on the mirror you hadn't quite buffed out. But not at you. She had stopped being bothered by that a long time ago. What surprised her was how useful it turned out to be. That particular Tuesday morning started the way they all did. She was in the service elevator of the Ardmore, a residential tower on the Upper West Side, where she had been contracted for the past 7 months. Her cart loaded, and her shift sheet folded into her apron pocket. The elevator was narrow and slow, and smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and someone else's long day. The button for the 14th floor was worn smooth from years of being pressed by hands exactly like hers. She stepped out into the service corridor and started her rounds. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now let's jump right back in. Room 1402 had a meal tray outside the door that had been there since the previous evening. She recognized the tray because she was the one who had cleaned the hallway the night before. The food on it was untouched, not rearranged, not partially eaten, untouched. She noted it the way she noted everything, quietly and without drama, filed it in the part of her mind that kept a running record of the details no one else thought were worth keeping. She had been doing that for years, keeping the record. It was not a diary. It was not anything she had ever tried to explain to anyone, because the few times she had, the response was a kind of polite blankness, the look people gave you when they heard something but could not locate a category for it. What she kept was a notebook, small and black, tucked in the front pocket of her bag. In it she wrote down the things she noticed. The woman in 902 who had stopped opening her blinds 3 days running. The fresh bruise on the inside of the forearm of the resident on 12 who always wore long sleeves in summer. The elderly man on 7 whose medication bottles sat untouched on the nightstand when she came in for turn-down service, day after day, and no one else seemed to have noticed or asked. She noticed all of it. She always had. She had just never had anyone who thought her observations were worth anything. The corridor on 14 was quiet at this hour. She worked steadily, the way she did everything, with a particular economy of motion that came from years of doing a physical job well. She had learned early that efficiency was its own kind of dignity. You couldn't control the hours or the pay, or the way people looked through you, but you could control how you moved through your work. She was on her 3rd room when she heard Jordan Ellis announce herself the way she always did, not loudly exactly, but with a kind of bright, inhabiting energy that made any space she entered feel suddenly occupied. She came down the service corridor in her catering uniform, bold hooped earrings catching the fluorescent light, hair wrapped and impeccable even at 7 in the morning. "You're early," Alicia said, without turning around. Pre-shift set up for the luncheon on 18. Jordan leaned against the supply cart and tilted her head toward the untouched meal tray. "That the Callaway unit?" Alicia nodded. "3rd time this week," Jordan said, and there was no judgment in it, just recognition. Jordan had been working service long enough to keep her own records. They ate their break together in the small room off the service corridor where the staff kept their bags and their phones and, on good days, a box of something someone had brought in. It was not a comfortable room. It was not meant to be comfortable. It had 2 folding chairs, a narrow table, and a microwave that took 4 full minutes to heat anything. But it was theirs, in the specific way that spaces become yours when no one else wants them. Leisha was pulling out her notebook to add the Callaway tray when Jordan reached over without ceremony and tapped the cover. "You've been writing in that thing since we met. What actually goes in there?" Leisha hesitated. She thought of all the times she had started to explain it and watched the blankness settle over someone's face. She opened her random page anyway and passed it across the table. Jordan read it slowly, not the skimming people did when they were being polite. She read it the way you read something that is making you recalibrate. Her finger moved down the page. Then she turned to the next one. Then she looked up. "Leisha." Her voice had lost its usual easy warmth, not in a bad way, in the way of someone who has just understood something. "This is a whole system. You've been building a whole system in a little black notebook. It's just notes. It is not just notes." Jordan set the notebook down on the table between them and looked at her with an expression Leisha could not immediately name. It was not pity. It was not the polite blankness she had braced for. It was something closer to the feeling of being handed a mirror and finding the reflection sharper than expected. "Do you know how many people have walked through these same buildings and never once thought to write any of this down? How many people saw the woman on 12 and just kept moving?" Leisha said nothing. "You've been doing something real this whole time," Jordan said simply. "And you've been treating it like it's nothing." The room was quiet for a moment. The microwave hummed. Somewhere in the corridor outside, a cart wheel squeaked against the tile. Leisha looked at her notebook on the table. She had filled 4 of them over the past 2 years. They lived in a shoebox under her bed because she had not known what else to do with them, and she had not known what they were for. She had assumed, in the vague way you assume things about yourself when no one has told you otherwise, that they were for nothing. A private habit. A quirk. Jordan was still looking at her, not with the careful brightness of someone being kind, just directly, honestly, the way Jordan looked at everything. It was a small moment. It would not have looked like much to anyone watching from the doorway, but something in Leisha's chest shifted, quietly, the way the first drawer of a stuck lock turns before the rest of it gives. Someone had looked at the thing she kept tucked away, the part of herself she had never thought to name aloud, and called it real. She took the notebook back and put it in her bag. "Eat your food," she said. "You're going to be late." Jordan grinned and picked up her fork. "I'm just saying. I know what you're saying." She had, in fact, been thinking about it for weeks without knowing she was thinking about it. The notebook, the records, the question that kept surfacing in the quiet moments between rooms and would not stay down. What any of it was actually for, if she kept it only for herself. She thought about it again now, sitting across from the only person in her life who had ever looked at the whole of her, the calloused hands, and the $63 in her account, and the safety pins holding her hem in place, and the 4 notebooks in a shoebox, and found something worth seeing. She had grown up in a family where money was the subject that was never quite mentioned because there was never quite enough of it. She had watched her mother work double shifts to cover her sister Maya's medical bills, had gone through 2 years of community college on financial aid that ran out before the degree did, had been carrying the ghost of those student loans like a second skeleton ever since. When she had started in service work at 18, it was supposed to be temporary. She understood now that a lot of things described as temporary were simply permanent situations that hadn't admitted it yet. But there was something she had never been able to make herself feel about any of it, and that was shame. She had tried, briefly, at 22, when a former classmate had run into her pushing a cart through a hotel lobby, and done the particular thing people do when they encounter someone who's gone down a different path than expected. She had gone home that night, and sat with the feeling for a while, turned it over, examined it. Then she had put it down. She was good at her work. She was precise and reliable, and she noticed things that no one else noticed. She moved through some of the most expensive buildings in Manhattan as if she had been born knowing their floor plans. Outside the narrow window at the end of the room, the city was fully awake now. All glass and morning light, and the dense, indifferent energy of 10 million people moving through their days. The towers glittered. The streets hummed. The lobby of the Ardmore would be filling with residents in beautiful coats hailing cars to take them to lives that would never require them to learn the service elevator schedule. Leisha watched it for a moment. Then she finished her coffee, tucked her notebook into her bag, and got back to work. She had 14 rooms left on her sheet. There was a woman on 12 who hadn't opened her blinds in 3 days, and an elderly man on 7 whose medication bottles hadn't moved. Someone needed to be paying attention. She was very good at paying attention. She finished the 14th floor by 9:30. The woman in 1402 still had not opened her door. Leisha made a note in her notebook, the date and time, and a small asterisk that meant she would look again on her next pass. She did not knock. She had learned the particular difference between a person who needed space and a person who needed help, and the tray sitting cold in the corridor since yesterday evening was tipping the balance in a direction she did not like. She would mention it to the building supervisor before her shift ended. She always did. Whether anything came of it was rarely up to her. The elevator took her back to the service floor, and she worked her way through the rest of the morning with the steady, unhurried focus that had become her natural register. She was not someone who moved fast for the sake of looking busy. She moved at exactly the speed the work required. By 11:30, she had turned over 8 rooms, restocked 2 linen carts, and flagged the medication situation on 7 for the 3rd time in a week, with a note slipped under the building manager's door. The note would probably be filed somewhere and forgotten. She wrote it anyway. It was Jordan who found her in the corridor at 11:45, already half out of her catering jacket, her earrings catching the fluorescent light in the way they always did, as if they refused to be dimmed by the setting. "They need bodies upstairs," Jordan said. "The agency sent 2 people for a 40-person luncheon, and the supervisor is losing her mind. You did silver service at the Hargrove last spring, right?" Leisha had. A single shift, picked up for the extra $40, standing very still in a room of very loud people and moving between them like furniture that happened to carry food. "I have 6 rooms left on my sheet. I already squared it with Patterson. He owes me from the Riverside thing." Jordan was already moving toward the service stairs. "Come on. They're paying out for the full event staff rate." The extra money was the thing that decided it. The way the extra money always decided it. Leisha pulled off her housekeeping apron, tucked her notebook into her bag, and followed. The 18th floor was a private event space the building hired out for corporate lunches and charity functions, and the particular category of social gathering where women who lunched did so in rooms with good floral arrangements and better lighting. By the time Leisha arrived, it was already set. 40 chairs around linen-covered tables, the kind of centerpieces that cost more than her weekly pay. A soft murmur of conversation already building as guests filtered in from the lobby elevators. She took her position at the far service station and did what she did best. She disappeared into the room. This was not a performance. It was not even a decision. It was simply what happened when you had spent enough years learning the particular art of being present without being noticed. You moved at the right speed, kept your eyes at the right level, carried your tray at the right angle. You became part of the room's furniture, and the room moved around you, and you saw everything. She saw the woman near the window first. She was perhaps 60, silver-haired, dressed with the specific restraint of someone for whom elegance was a lifelong habit rather than an occasion. She sat slightly apart from the table's main conversation, not excluded exactly, but occupying the polite outer edge of the group the way certain women do, when they're guests by association rather than by invitation. There was a dignity to how she held herself that Leisha recognized, the particular uprightness of a woman who had learned to be looked through without letting it show. She was with a younger man, or rather, the younger man was near her, standing a few feet to the side in the way of someone who was simultaneously part of the room and separate from it. He was talking to no one. He was watching everything. Leisha noticed him the way she noticed things that were out of place, and he was out of place in a way she could not immediately name. Not because he did not belong in a room like this. He looked as though he had been in 1,000 rooms like this. It was something else. The quality of his stillness, the way his eyes moved, not casually, not socially, but with the slow, comprehensive attention of someone doing a different kind of reading than everyone else in the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a suit that fit the way suits fit on men for whom suits are not an occasion but a default. Dark hair with silver threading at the temples, and his hands, when she caught a glimpse of them as he lifted a glass, were scarred at the knuckles in a way that did not match the rest of the picture. She looked away before he could feel her looking. She moved to the next table. The room continued its soft, expensive hum. She was refilling water glasses on the far side of the room when she heard the shift. Not loud, not a scene, not yet, just a tightening in the air. The way a room changes register when something is beginning to go wrong. The woman speaking was perhaps 55, well-dressed and slightly too composed in the way of someone who had been drinking since before the event officially started. She was standing close to the silver-haired woman by the window. Too close. The territorial proximity of someone pressing a point. Her voice was low, but not low enough. I'm only saying, Margarita, that certain invitations are extended out of courtesy. There's no need to make a habit of it. The silver-haired woman, Margarita, did not flinch. She smiled the way women who have practiced dignity smile at things that do not deserve it. A small, contained, perfectly correct smile that gave nothing away. The other woman's hand came up. It was not a slow movement. It was the movement of someone who had decided, in the private arithmetic of their own importance, that they were not being taken seriously, and intended to correct that. The hand rose with a sharp, dismissive energy aimed directly at Margarita's face. Leisha was 4 feet away. She did not think about it. There was no calculation, no consideration of consequences, no moment of weighing what she stood to lose. Something moved in her before her mind had finished forming the sentence. The same reflex that made you reach for a falling glass before you had registered it was falling. She stepped between them. Her own hand came up and caught the other woman's wrist, not roughly, but with a quiet, unmistakable firmness. The kind of firmness that had its own language. The movement was over in 2 seconds. She released the wrist and stepped back into position, her tray level, her face composed, as if she had simply moved to clear a glass. The room had gone very still. Margarita looked at her, not through her, at her, with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what had just happened, and exactly what it had cost the young woman in the catering uniform who had done it. Leisha met her eyes for one moment. Then she looked back at her tray and moved to the next table. She did not look toward the window. She did not need to. She could feel it without looking, the same way you feel weather, a change in pressure, a weight and stillness in a specific direction. She knew without turning around that the man with the scarred hands had seen every second of it. She knew it the way she knew the things she wrote in her notebook, not from evidence she could point to, but from the specific, practiced attention of someone who had spent years reading rooms other people walked through without seeing. She kept moving. She cleared plates. She refilled glasses. She did not allow herself to feel the particular trembling in her hands that she was pressing very carefully down into the core of herself and refusing to acknowledge. She was still invisible. She was certain of it. She was wrong. She did not see him again that day. The luncheon ended the way those things always ended, with the quiet industry of staff clearing linens and folding napkins and breaking down the kind of afternoon that cost more to assemble than she earned in a month. Jordan found her at the service station and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with an expression that was trying to decide whether to be impressed or worried, and had not quite landed on either. I saw what you did, Jordan said finally. I moved to clear a glass. Leisha. I moved to clear a glass, and my hand happened to be in the way. She kept her eyes on the tray she was stacking. It was nothing. Jordan let that sit for exactly as long as it deserved to sit. The woman you stepped in front of. Do you know who she is? Leisha shook her head. Margarita Toscano. Jordan said it the way you say a name, when the name itself is supposed to carry meaning. When it didn't register on Leisha's face, she continued more quietly. Her son owns this building, Leisha. He owns 4 buildings on this block, and probably several things that don't show up in any public record. Leisha stacked the last glass and picked up the tray. Then I hope she enjoyed the luncheon. She went back to her remaining rooms on 14. She finished her shift. She took the service elevator down, signed out with Patterson, and walked the 11 blocks to the subway because it was a Tuesday, and she was trying to make the week's Metro card last until Friday. She did not think about the man with the scarred hands. She was very deliberate about not thinking about him. She thought about him the entire way home. It was 3 days before the first thing happened. She arrived for her Thursday shift and found a new envelope in her staff mailbox. The narrow row of slots beside the sign-in sheet that mostly collected agency memos and the occasional reminder about uniform policy. The envelope had her name on it in the building management standard font. Inside was a contract amendment. Single page, formal language, the kind of document that required a signature and a date. She read it twice standing at the mailbox. Then she read it a third time. Effective immediately, her position at the Ardmore was being converted from a rolling agency contract to a permanent building staff placement. The hourly rate had been adjusted. The new figure was $11 more than her current one. The contract included health care coverage beginning at 90 days. She stood there for a long moment with the paper in her hands. Her first feeling was not gratitude. She examined that with the same careful attention she gave to everything and confirmed it. What she felt was a wariness that started at the base of her spine and moved upward, the specific, practiced alertness of someone who had learned through long experience that things which arrived without explanation usually came with terms that hadn't been mentioned yet. She signed the contract because she was not in a position not to sign it. She slid it back into the return envelope and kept her face neutral at the front desk. But she tucked the copy into her bag next to her notebook, and that evening she sat at her kitchen table under the single overhead light and read it again, looking for the part she had missed. She did not find it, but that did not make her less wary. It made her more. She called Jordan. $11 more, Jordan said, and Leisha could hear her earrings moving as she turned her head, the way they always did when she was thinking. Out of nowhere. Out of nowhere. A pause. And nobody called you in. Nobody explained it. A contract in a mailbox. Jordan was quiet for a moment. In the specific way, she was quiet when she was choosing between saying the careful thing and the honest thing. She almost always chose the honest thing. Leisha, that building is owned by Bruno Toscano. You stepped between his mother and a woman who was about to put her hand across her face. In front of him. And 3 days later you get a raise and a permanent contract from building management. I know. That is not a coincidence. I know that too. So what are you going to do about it? Leisha looked at the contract on her table. She thought about the way she had felt him watching, the particular weight and stillness of it, the quality of attention she had not been able to shake. She thought about what Jordan had told her, the buildings and the things that didn't show up in public records. She thought about what it meant when a man with that kind of reach decided to notice you. I'm going to go to work tomorrow, she said, and I'm going to notice what I notice. Jordan made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite warning. It lived in the space between the two, which was exactly where Jordan's best assessments tended to live. She hung up and sat for a while longer in her kitchen. The city made its nighttime sounds outside the window. Somewhere in the building above her, a neighbor's television murmured. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date. And then below it she wrote the contract details and the figure and the words. No source given. No explanation offered. Then she drew a small circle around it the way she circled things she was not done thinking about. She was not done thinking about this. What she did not know, because she had no way of knowing it, was that 30 blocks uptown in an office with 3 monitors and a city view that looked like a conquered kingdom, a man had spent the better part of 2 days asking careful questions about a woman in a catering uniform who had done a very small thing that he could not stop thinking about. Manuel Rossi had brought him the information in the way Manuel always brought information. Quietly, completely, without editorial. An agency worker, 26, 7 months at the Ardmore. Clean record. No complaints, no incidents. 3 buildings prior to this one. each with supervisor notes that used variations of the same phrase. Thorough, reliable, notices things. He had read that last part twice. Bruno Toscano was not a man who acted on impulse. He had built everything he had by being the opposite of impulsive, by thinking 3 moves ahead, and 4 scenarios deep, and never, under any circumstances, allowing what he felt to outpace what he knew. He had learned this at 22, when his father was put in the ground and the organization was handed to him like a loaded weapon, and he had not unlearned it since. He had made the contract change through the building management company because it was clean and unattributable and gave her something real without requiring anything in return. He had been very precise about that last part. Nothing that required anything in return. Manuel had stood in the doorway of the office while he signed the authorization and said nothing, which was how Manuel communicated when he had something to say, but was deciding whether it was his place to say it. "What?" Bruno said, without looking up. "Victor's man was at the Hargrove event last week," Manuel said. "3rd time in proximity, this month." Bruno set down the pen. He did not look alarmed, because he did not look alarmed. He looked the way he always looked, which was like the moment before something happened. "Which one?" "Petrov, the one who watches exits." A pause. The city hummed below the windows. "Tighten the rotation on the residential buildings," Bruno said. "All 4. Manuel nodded and left the doorway. Bruno looked at the signed authorization on his desk for a moment. Then he added it to the outgoing file, turned back to his monitors, and did not allow himself to think about a woman with calloused hands and a tray held at exactly the right angle, moving through a room as if she had been born knowing its floor plan. He almost succeeded. The new contract changed one thing, and one thing only. She stopped worrying about the Metro card. Everything else stayed exactly as it had been. She arrived through the service entrance. She took the service elevator. She ate her lunch in the break room with the slow microwave and the folding chairs. The raise was real and the health care was real, and she was carefully grateful for both in the private way she was grateful for things, without performing it for anyone. She had not been asked for anything in return. She intended to keep it that way. 2 weeks passed. The woman in 1402 finally opened her door on a Wednesday morning, and Lisha, passing with her cart, caught a glimpse of her in the hallway, thin and blinking in the light, and felt the specific relief of a worry that had been sitting in her chest finally setting itself down. She updated her notebook. Small asterisk. Resolved. The medication bottles on 7 had not moved. She had written 3 notes to building management about that now. She wrote a 4th, more detailed this time, and walked it to the supervisor's office herself instead of sliding it under the door. The supervisor, a tired man named Patterson, who was kind in the distracted way of someone with too many things on his desk, told her he would follow up. She thanked him and went back to work and did not believe him, which was not a judgment, simply an accurate reading of a man stretched too thin in a building too large. She was thinking about that, about the gap between the note written and the action taken, and all the space in between where things fell through. When she turned the corner on 11 and stopped, there was a man at the end of the corridor who did not belong there. She knew it the way she knew all the things she wrote in her notebook, not from a single piece of evidence, but from the accumulated texture of 100 small details registering at once. He was standing near the service access door, with the particular quality of stillness of someone waiting for something rather than going somewhere. His clothes were right for the building, but his shoes were wrong, the kind of wrong that only showed if he had spent years looking at the floors of expensive buildings, while the people above the floors moved through them without looking down. His eyes went to her cart before they went to her face, then moved past her to the corridor entrance in the quick, habitual sweep of someone checking exits. She had seen that sweep before. Recently, she finished her floor. She did not change her pace or her expression. She took the elevator down to the lobby level and found the head of building security, a man named Graves who had worked the Ardmore for 6 years and who she had exchanged perhaps 40 words with across 7 months. 11, she said, near the service access. He's been there at least 20 minutes. His shoes don't match. Graves looked at her. His shoes, she said again, without apology. Everything else is right. The shoes are the kind you wear when you put together an outfit to fit a building you don't usually move through. The right building but the wrong floor. Service access on 11 doesn't connect to any resident units. There's no reason to stand there. Graves was already reaching for his radio. She went back to work. She did not find out until 2 days later what had happened next, and she found out the way she found out most things. Not through official channels, but through the specific, efficient information network of the people who kept the building running. Nadia told her. Nadia Vasquez from the third floor team, 54 years old with a silver-streaked braid and a bad knee she never mentioned, who had a way of knowing things that moved through the service corridors of the Ardmore the way water moved through pipes, quietly, and along the path of least resistance. They held him for questioning, Nadia said, folding towels with the practiced speed of someone who had folded towels in her sleep. Security and 2 men who didn't work for the building. What 2 men? Nadia's hands kept moving, the kind that come when the building's owner wants something looked at carefully. Leisha said nothing. She picked up the next towel. You're the one who flagged him, Nadia said. It was not a question. I mentioned something to Graves. Nadia glanced at her sideways, a look that carried more than it said, and then went back to the towels. That was the thing about Nadia. She never pushed past the door you left open. She noted where it was, and moved on. Leisha thought about it for the rest of the day. She thought about it on the elevator and in the corridor of 14, and during the 20 minutes she spent writing a 5th, identical note about the medication bottles on 7 that she had little confidence would be acted on. She was thinking about it still when she turned a corner near the building's east stairwell and found herself 3 feet from Bruno Toscano. He was alone. That surprised her, because men like him were never alone in the way he appeared alone. Unaccompanied was more accurate. The 2 men she had clocked in the lobby as belonging to him positioned far enough away to give the impression of privacy, while remaining exactly close enough to eliminate it. He looked at her with the same quality of attention she had felt from across the room at the luncheon. Direct, unhurried, the kind of attention that assessed without performing assessment. You flagged Petrov, he said. It was not a question either. I flagged someone who didn't belong on 11. You knew he didn't belong from his shoes. I knew from several things. The shoes were one of them. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmly, not yet, but something recalibrated. She watched it happen the way she watched things happen in rooms, carefully, without showing that she was watching. My security team has a protocol for identifying external threats, he said. They had run 2 sweeps of that floor. I know, she said. I passed them. A brief silence. The east stairwell hummed with the building's ambient noise. What else do you notice? He said. She considered him. She considered the question, whether it was a test or genuine curiosity, and she could not fully separate the two, and she decided it did not matter. The man on 7 has not touched his medication bottles in 4 weeks. I have written 5 notes to building management. Nothing has been done. He is elderly, and he lives alone, and either he is not taking his medication or someone is not ensuring he has access to it. And both of those situations have a direction they tend to move in if no one pays attention. He looked at her steadily. 7. Unit number. 702. He said nothing for a moment. Then he took out his phone, typed something brief, and put it away. She understood then, with a clarity that settled over her like cold water, that what he had just done would be acted on before the end of the day. Not filed, not forwarded to a tired supervisor with too many things on his desk. Acted on, directly, immediately, because he had heard her and found what she said worth responding to. She had spent 8 years writing things in a notebook that no one read. She had spent 8 years noticing what no one else noticed and offering it to people who received it politely and set it down. He had listened. She stood in the corridor with her cart and understood that this, of all the things that had happened in the past 2 weeks, was the thing she needed to be most careful about. Not the contract, not the raise, not even the weight of his attention across a room. This, because the most dangerous thing was not a man with power and scarred hands and a city spread below his office, like a conquered kingdom. The most dangerous thing was a man who listened. She straightened her apron. "I have 6 rooms left on my sheet," she said. He stepped aside. She pushed her cart past him and went back to work. Behind her, she heard him make one more call. His voice was quiet and precise, and she did not catch the words. She did not need to. She opened her notebook at the next corridor and wrote 2 sentences. Then she drew a circle around them and kept moving, because she had 6 rooms left and the day was not finished, and she had learned a long time ago that the most important thing you could do was keep moving. The man in 702 had a doctor at his door by Thursday afternoon. Leisha found out for Nadia, which was how she found out most things that move through the building's quiet channels. A physician, private practice, not the kind who made house calls for anyone below a certain tax bracket. He had visited twice in 4 days. The medication situation had been sorted. The elderly man, whose name she had never known and still did not know, had apparently been confused about his dosage instructions, a simple thing that had been quietly compounding for a month, while 5 notes sat in a supervisor's filing system going nowhere. She stood at her cart on 7 and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. Not satisfaction exactly. Something quieter than that. The specific, grounding feeling of a thing that mattered being treated as though it mattered. She did not write it in her notebook. Some things did not need to be written down. What changed after the corridor conversation was not dramatic and not sudden. It was the kind of change that happened the way light changed in a room, slowly, and from no single identifiable direction, until at some point you simply noticed that things looked different than they had before. He did not seek her out. She did not seek him, but the building had its rhythms and its routes, and they occupied it differently now, with a mutual awareness that neither of them performed or acknowledged directly. She saw him twice in the following week, once in the lobby, where he was moving through with Manuel at his shoulder and 3 other men she had learned to read as belonging to his outer circle. He did not slow down. He did not look toward her specifically, but as he passed the service corridor entrance where she stood with her cart, he angled his path by perhaps 2 feet, a small, precise adjustment that put him briefly in her sight line. And she understood it as the thing it was, an acknowledgement, quiet, deniable, entirely deliberate. The second time was the elevator, the main elevator, which she almost never used and was only using because her cart had a stuck wheel and she needed the extra space. He was already inside. They rode 4 floors together in silence. She watched the numbers. He stood with his hands behind his back and said nothing, and she could feel him not filling the silence with something unnecessary, the way people who were uncomfortable with silence always did. And she thought, without meaning to, that she respected him for that. She told Jordan none of this. She told Jordan almost everything, but this she was holding at a careful distance, turning it over privately the way she turned over the things in her notebook, not yet ready to give it a shape by saying it out loud. Jordan told her anyway. "You're different," Jordan said. They were sitting in the break room on a slow Friday, split shift, Jordan in between a lunch teardown and an evening corporate setup. "You have the look you get when something is happening that you're not telling me about." "I don't have a look." "You have several looks. This is the one where you're measuring something." Jordan bit into an apple with a sharp, definitive crunch. "It's him, isn't it?" Leisha said nothing. The raise. The contract. The thing on 11 that got handled in 20 minutes when your notes on 7 sat for a month. Jordan pointed the apple at her. "He is paying attention to you paying attention, and you are paying attention to him paying attention to you paying attention. That is a lot of attention." "It is a concerning amount of attention, Leisha, from a man whose name makes building supervisors straighten their spines." Jordan set the apple down. "I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm just telling you I see it, and I want to know you see it too." "I see it," Leisha said. Jordan looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "Good." She picked up her apple again. "Just don't disappear into it." It was Nadia who gave the evening its full shape. They had coffee together for the first time that Friday. Not planned, simply concurrent. Nadia was on the tail end of her shift, and Leisha was on the front end of a catering pickup Jordan had arranged. and they were both in the break room at 20 past 4 with nowhere immediately to be. Nadia poured 2 cups from the pot that had been sitting since noon and said nothing about the quality of it, and Leisha said nothing either, and they sat in a companionable quiet that had its own texture. Nadia talked about her mother, not at length, not with the weight of someone asking for anything, the way you talk about people who are simply part of the fabric of your days. An elderly woman in the Bronx, a 1-bedroom apartment, a phone call every morning before the first shift because that was the arrangement they had arrived at, her mother and her, that the call meant I am here and everything is as it should be. Leisha listened with the full attention she gave to things that mattered. She had a bad week, Nadia said, her hands around the cup. I couldn't get there until Sunday. But you got there. Nadia shrugged. It was a particular shrug, the one Leisha had seen on women in break rooms and service corridors across 8 years of this work. The one that meant what choice do I have and I'll manage. And please don't make me say that out loud all at the same time. She had worn that shrug herself, many times, in many rooms. She recognized the way you recognized your own reflection. She sat with that recognition all the way through the evening's catering shift, a corporate dinner in a hotel ballroom on the east side, 40 tables, and a guest list that ran to 200. Jordan was supervising. Leisha worked the room the way she always did, invisible and attentive, tray level, eyes at the right height, moving through the space with a particular economy that was hers alone. She saw him 20 minutes into the dinner service. She had not known he would be there. There was no reason she should have. He was at a table near the room's center, Bruno to his right, and 2 other men she did not recognize to his left. Silver-haired, polished, the kind of face that had learned, over many years, how to present itself as open while giving nothing away. He could have been a senator. He could have been a board chair. He had the specific, cultivated air of a man who had spent decades making himself easy to trust at first impression. She watched the exits. She watched them because she was who she was and rooms were what they were. And in 20 seconds she had clocked that this man had already watched every exit in the room twice since she had been observing him, casually, between bites, in the way of someone for whom this was not caution but habit. She had seen the man on 11 watch exits. The quality was identical. His name she did not know, but she knew what he was, with the same bone-level certainty with which she knew the things she wrote in her notebook. She knew it from the way he smiled at Bruno and held something slightly in reserve behind the smile. She knew it from the way he looked at the people around him, not as dinner companions, but as variables. She knew it from the way his eyes moved to her tray as she passed, then past her face, then to the exit behind her shoulder, all in the space of a single second. She moved to the next table. She did not look back at Bruno. She did not signal anything. She simply continued her service and finished her rounds, and, at the first opportunity, she found Jordan near the kitchen entrance and said, very quietly, "The silver-haired man at table 9. Do you know who he is?" Jordan looked. Something tightened briefly around her eyes. "Victor Sokolov," she said. "He and Toscano have history." "Why?" Leisha thought about the man on 11. She thought about Nadia's shrug and the 5 notes, and the gap between what was noticed and what was acted on. She thought about a small black notebook and 4 years of records that had only ever been read by one person who thought they were worth something. "No reason," she said. "I noticed something." She opened her notebook on the service stairs during the break and wrote his name. Below it she wrote 3 observations: the exits, the smile with the reservation behind it, the way his attention moved. She drew a circle around all of it. Then she went back into the room and finished her shift, moving through it the way she always moved, quiet and precise, and entirely present. She was very good at noticing things. She was only now beginning to understand what that might be worth. She kept the notebook entry about Victor Sokolov to herself for 11 days. This was not avoidance. It was the particular patience she had developed over years of writing things down that no one had asked her to write down. The understanding that an observation was only as useful as the moment it was delivered into. She waited for the right moment the way she waited for everything. without announcing that she was waiting, simply moving through her days with the entry circled in the back of her mind like a stone she could feel the weight of. The right moment arrived on a Thursday, and it arrived through Manuel. She had been crossing the lobby when he fell into step beside her. Not intrusively, not with the quality of someone who had been waiting, simply alongside her. The way large men who were good at their work moved, efficiently and without drama. He handed her an envelope without preamble. Inside was a card for the building's executive level with her name printed on it, and an access tier she had not previously held. "Mr. Toscano would like you to have access to the penthouse level," Manuel said, in the tone of a man delivering a fact, "for the purpose of your standard duties." She looked at the card. "My standard duties don't include the penthouse level." "They do now." She looked at him then, directly. The way she looked at things she was trying to read completely. Manuel's face gave back very little, but it gave back enough. There was a watchfulness in him that was not unfriendly and not warm, the specific, careful attention of a man who had been assessing her for weeks and had arrived at something. Not a conclusion exactly, but a working position. "He's moving me closer," she said, not accusingly, simply accurately. "He's adjusting access," Manuel said. Then, after a pause that felt deliberate, "There are people who come through this building who are better understood from a distance. It is useful to have eyes that see differently." He left her in the lobby with the card in her hand, and the weight of what he had not quite said settling over her like weather. She used the card for the first time 2 days later. The penthouse level was 3 floors accessed by a single elevator that required the card and a code. She had been sent by text from a number she did not have saved. The service areas up there were what service areas always were, narrow and functional and invisible by design. But the building's quality at the elevation was different, the kind of different that existed in the specific textures of things, the weight of the door handles, the soundproofing in the walls, the particular quality of quiet that money bought and ordinary buildings could not replicate. She did her work. She was thorough and she was quiet and she noticed everything. What she noticed over the following week was this. The penthouse operated on a tension that she could not name, but could read the way she read rooms. Not loudly, not in any single observable thing, but in the aggregate texture of small details. Manuel's routes through the building were changing, subtly. The way security routes changed when security was tightening. The number of men she did not recognize but could identify as belonging to Bruno's outer circle had increased. Twice she had arrived on the level to find a conversation ending, not abruptly, but with the specific efficiency of people who had learned to close discussions cleanly when unnecessary witnesses were present. She wrote it all down. She circled Viktor Sokolov's name again and drew a line connecting it. The night it happened, she was not supposed to be there. She had left her notebook. She realized it on the subway home. 2 stops in. The specific dread of having left the wrong thing in the wrong place moving through her chest before she had fully registered the thought. She rode back. She signed in again with Patterson, who did not ask because she had a permanent contract and a reason that was real. She took the service elevator to the penthouse level. The corridor was wrong before she opened the door. She could not have explained it to anyone who had not spent years reading rooms, but the quality of the air was different. The specific, weighted stillness of a space where something had recently resolved itself. The way a room felt after a storm that had already passed, but left everything slightly changed in its wake. The lights were on in the service corridor. One of the supply closet doors was open and had not been left open by her. She found her notebook where she had left it, tucked behind the folded linens on the 3rd shelf. She held it against her chest for a moment and stood very still, listening to the building. She should have left. She walked toward the service exit instead, and then stopped. Through the narrow rectangle of the interior door's small window, she could see the kitchen. Bruno was at the counter, alone. He was standing with both hands flat on the marble surface, not leaning, simply still, in the way of someone whose body had arrived at a resting point not out of ease, but out of the specific exhaustion that came from the kind of sustained control that was itself a form of labor. There was a cup of tea beside his left hand. It was not steaming. He had not touched it. He was in a dark shirt, not a suit, and this was somehow more information than anything else she had seen of him. This small departure from his usual precise presentation, the way it showed the shape of the cost the evening had extracted without telling her anything specific about what the evening had been. She saw Manuel then. He was in the doorway at the far end of the kitchen, standing in the way he stood when he was at rest and still fully ready, hands at his sides. His hands were clean. His face was the face he always wore, neutral and contained. But his eyes, when she caught them through the small window before he registered her presence, held something that his face did not, something that had not been there 2 weeks ago. Manuel saw her. He looked at her for a long moment through the glass. He did not wave her away. She stayed where she was. Bruno had not moved. He was looking at something outside the kitchen window, the city's nighttime grid of light and dark, enormous and indifferent and running on its own logic, entirely separate from whatever had happened in this building tonight. She watched him watching it and thought about what Jordan had said, about not disappearing into something, and thought about what she had written in her notebook the first night. She had understood he was actually listening to her. She thought about Nadia's shrug, about the woman on 12 who had finally opened her blinds, about 5 notes that went nowhere and 1 conversation that sent a doctor to an old man's door before the day was out. She thought about the question that had been sharpening in the back of her mind for weeks, the one she had not yet let herself ask all the way to its end, whether good things could grow in dark soil, whether the observation of that darkness made her responsible for it, whether staying, knowing what she knew, was complicity or something else, something that did not yet have a clean name. Bruno turned from the window. He saw her through the glass. At the same moment, she realized she had been standing there long enough that leaving would be its own kind of statement. His expression did not change in the way of surprise. It changed in the smaller way of a man adjusting to a new piece of information and filing it without drama. She pushed the door open. She did not say anything. She walked to the counter and picked up his tea and set it in the microwave and pressed 2 minutes without asking, and then turned around and leaned against the counter with her notebook under her arm and waited. He watched her do all of this. "You should not be here this late," he said finally. "I left my notebook." The microwave hummed. The city lights held steady outside the window. "You saw Manuel," he said. "Yes." "And?" She looked at him directly. "I'm still here," she said. It was not a romantic declaration. It was not any kind of declaration she had a tidy label for. It was the simple, precise truth of a decision she had made in the corridor, turning over the question that had been building for weeks, and arriving at an answer that felt less like resolution than like the first step onto unfamiliar ground, the specific, grounding feeling of a choice made with full information. The microwave finished. She set the tea in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. Something in his face shifted. Not warmly, not quickly, but in the slow, almost bewildered way of a man encountering something he did not have a prepared response for, and finding, against all expectation, that he did not want one. She picked up her notebook. "I'll see myself out," she said. Manuel was no longer in the doorway. She walked back through the service corridor, down the elevator, and out through the entrance into the night. The city enormous and alive around her, her notebook pressed against her chest, and her hands entirely steady. She had made her decision. Now she would find out what it cost. 3 weeks after the night, she stood in Bruno's kitchen and reheated his tea. The Kozlov situation resolved itself in the particular way that things in his world resolved themselves, not with paperwork or proceedings, but with a silence that descended over the building like a change in weather and stayed. She did not ask about it. He did not explain it. What she understood from the texture of things. The way Manuel's routes through the building returned to their previous patterns. The way the outer circle of men thinned back to its usual number. The way Bruno moved through his floors with the specific quality of a man who had set something down that he had been carrying for a long time. She understood also, without anyone telling her, that people had been hurt. She did not know the details and she did not seek them. She held what she had decided in the kitchen corridor, and she continued to hold it, not without weight, but steadily. The way you carry a thing when you have chosen to carry it with full knowledge of what it is. The building moved back into its ordinary rhythms, and she moved with it. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the kitchen, when she found Nadia in the service hallway of the 14th floor. She heard the cart first, the specific sound of a cleaning cart that was not moving, just sitting, its wheels still, in a corridor where everything was usually in motion. She turned the corner and found Nadia standing beside it with a folded piece of paper in her hands, and an expression that was not distress exactly, because Nadia's face did not easily show distress. It was something more contained than that. The look of a woman who had received information and was in the process of absorbing it without allowing it to show more than was necessary. Nadia, Leisha said. Nadia looked up. She held out the paper. It was a contract termination notice from the building management company, effective end of the current billing cycle. The language was the language of those things, efficient and impersonal, words like restructuring and operational adjustment that meant nothing except that a decision had been made somewhere about which bodies were necessary, and which were not in Nadia's name, had landed on the wrong list. Leisha read it to the end. Then she read it again. When did you get this? She said. This morning. In the mailbox. Not a conversation. Not an explanation. A piece of paper in a slot. Leisha stood in the corridor with the notice in her hand and felt something move through her that she did not immediately try to name. It was not surprise. That was the thing that made it worse. It was not surprise at all. Nadia took the paper back and folded it along its existing crease with the precise, economical movements of someone who had learned not to waste energy on things that could not be changed by the expenditure of it. She tucked it into her apron pocket. She looked at her cart for a moment, and in that look Leisha saw the whole of it. The bad me that had never been seen to, the mother in the Bronx, the phone call every morning that meant I am still here. The 4 years of showing up exactly as promised to a building that had just decided she was a line item. What will you do? Leisha said. Nadia shrugged. It was the shrug she had seen on women in break rooms and service corridors across 8 years of this work, and she had worn it herself, and she had thought she knew what it meant. But standing here in this particular corridor with this particular woman, she understood it more completely than she ever had. All its layers at once. What choice do I have? And I'll figure out, and please don't make me say that out loud, and underneath all of those, quieter and deeper, the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent a lifetime being treated as replaceable and has become, through sheer necessity, very good at absorbing it without breaking. Leisha sat down on the floor. There was no graceful way to do it. She simply sat, back against the wall between the cleaning cart and the supply closet, the same way she had eaten lunch in corridors like this one for years, hunched and small and entirely present. She looked up at Nadia. After a moment, Nadia sat down beside her. They did not say very much. There was not very much to say that would not have been inadequate to the situation, and they were both women who understood the inadequacy of words offered into a silence that had its own weight and texture and needed to be sat with rather than filled. Nadia talked a little about her mother. Leisha listened with the full attention she had always given to things that mattered. When they stood up, she walked Nadia to the elevator. She stood with her hand on the wall after the doors closed, long after, looking at the number above the door until it reached the lobby level and stopped. Then she stood there for a while longer. Something was happening in her chest that she had not felt before, or had not felt all at once like this. It was not grief exactly, and it was not anger exactly, though it had the texture of both. It was the specific, clarifying feeling of something that had been accumulating for a long time, arriving at a point of critical mass and becoming, finally, impossible to hold as separate pieces. The notebook in her bag, 4 of them in a shoebox under her bed, 8 years of noticing, 5 notes about a man's medication, Nadia's bad knee, the woman on 12 who had finally opened her blinds, the gap between what was seen and what was acted on, a gap so wide and so old that most people who fell into it simply disappeared. She went back to work. She finished her floors. She was thorough, and she was efficient, and she kept her face entirely composed. It was Victor who found her in the lobby at the end of her shift. He was not there by accident. She understood that immediately, the same way she had understood what he was at the dinner 3 weeks ago. From the accumulated texture of 100 small details registering at once, he was standing near the lobby entrance in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, and he looked at her the way he looked at variables, assessing the weight and position of a thing he was considering moving. "Miss Greco," he said, which told her he had done his research, which she had expected. She looked at him and said nothing. "You've been spending time in interesting parts of this building," he said. "I thought it might be worth a conversation." He smiled the way he had smiled at Bruno at the dinner, warmly, and with something held in reserve behind it. "Bruno Toscano is a complicated man to be close to. I imagine you've begun to understand that." She held his gaze with the specific steadiness of someone who had read him in a room at 20 paces, and had not been surprised by anything he had done since. "I have floors to sign out," she said. "Of course." He did not move from her path. "I only want you to know that there are people who appreciate discretion, people who can make certain situations considerably more comfortable for someone in your position." He let that sit for a moment. "Nadia Vasquez, for instance. I understand she received some difficult news today. Those things can sometimes be reconsidered when the right people take an interest." The lobby hummed around them. Residents moved through it, oblivious and unhurried, the building's ordinary life continuing on its ordinary frequency. She looked at Viktor Sokolov and understood completely what he was doing, and what he thought she was: a variable, a pressure point, a thing without power that could be repositioned with the right application of leverage. He had looked at her the way people had looked at her for 8 years, through her, past her, at the things she carried rather than at her face, and he had made the same calculation they all made. She was useful. She was manageable. She could be moved. She felt something settle in her, cold and clear and entirely without drama. "Excuse me," she said, and walked past him to the sign-out desk. She did not look back. She signed out with Patterson, tucked her copy of the sheet into her bag alongside her notebook, and walked out through the service entrance into the evening air. She took the subway home. She sat in her kitchen under the single overhead light and put her notebook on the table and looked at it for a long time. Then she got up and went to her closet and pulled the shoebox from the shelf and took out all 4 of the older notebooks and set them on the table beside the current one. 5 notebooks, 8 years, hundreds of pages of things seen and recorded and offered to people who did not know what to do with them. She thought about Nadia on the elevator. She thought about Victor's smile. She thought about the gap, the enormous, grinding gap between what was noticed and what was protected. She had been sitting in that gap her whole life. She picked up her pen and opened to a fresh page and began to write. Not an observation this time. Something different. Something she had been thinking about without knowing she was thinking about it. Assembling itself from 8 years of evidence into a shape that was finally clear enough to put into words. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When she finished, she sat back and looked at what she had written. Then she picked up her phone and texted Jordan. Not tonight. Not with words. Just, tomorrow. The break room, bring coffee. She put her phone face down and went back to the page. She had something to build. Jordan arrived 12 minutes late with 2 coffees and the expression of someone who had been turning over a text message since the night before. She set 1 cup in front of Leisha and sat down across from her and looked at the pages on the table between them. 7 sheets of notepaper covered in Leisha's handwriting, organized into columns and subsections with the specific, practiced neatness of someone who had spent years making careful records in small spaces. She read without speaking. She turned the pages slowly, the way she had turned the notebook pages months ago in this same room, with the full attention of someone who understood what they were looking at was not nothing. Leisha drank her coffee and let her read. This is a business plan, Jordan said finally. It's the beginning of one. Leisha. Jordan looked up. This is a real business plan. You have a staffing model, a placement structure, a training outline, a support framework for workers leaving hostile employment. She tapped the third page. You have a legal fund outlined in principle. I know what I wrote. Jordan set the pages down and looked at her with a particular directness she reserved for moments she considered important enough not to approach sideways. How long have you been thinking about this? I don't know. Years, maybe, without knowing it. The notebooks. The gap between what gets noticed and what gets done. Nadia. She paused. Victor. At that name, Jordan's expression tightened. Leisha had told her about the lobby encounter the previous evening, relaying it with the same flat, precise accuracy she brought to everything. And Jordan had listened with the compressed stillness of someone filing something under things that confirm what I already suspected. He approached you directly, Jordan said. He thought I was a pressure point. You are a pressure point. I know. Leisha folded her hands around her cup. That is not the same as being movable. Jordan was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the pages again. The funding, she said. You've left that section incomplete. Yes. Because you know where it would have to come from. Yes. The break room's microwave hummed its slow hum. Somewhere in the corridor outside, a cart will cross a threshold with its familiar squeak. He funded the contract, Jordan said carefully. He handled the situation on 11, the doctor on 7. But this is different. This is a real organization. This is you being publicly attached to something connected to him. I know that too. And you're not afraid of it. Leisha considered this honestly, the way she considered everything she was not yet sure of. I'm not afraid of visible, she said. I have been invisible for 8 years and I have 4 notebooks in a shoebox that no one was ever going to act on. I am done with invisible. Jordan looked at her for a long moment, the wariness and the belief in her face in equal measure, both of them present and neither one winning. Then she picked up her coffee. Okay, she said. Okay. I'm not going to pretend I'm not worried about the Victor piece. I'm not asking you to pretend anything. And I'm going to say things you won't want to hear sometimes. You always do. It's why I texted you last night. Jordan almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. She tapped the pages one more time. A small, decisive gesture. Make the budget section clean, she said. If you're going to walk into that office with this, you walk in with numbers. Leisha spent the rest of the day on the numbers. She did it at the kitchen table after her shift with the careful, methodical attention of someone who had spent years doing more with less and understood the grammar of a tight budget from the inside out. She knew what things cost because she had always had to know what things cost. She knew what a rented midtown office ran per month at the lower end of the market. She knew what it cost to employ 2 people, to run a basic case management system, to provide even minimal emergency housing provision through a partner organization. She knew what a retainer for a single employment lawyer looked like because she had once spent 45 minutes on a legal aid website trying to understand whether she had any recourse over an unpaid shift and had come away knowing more about employment law than she had expected. She built the budget the way she built everything, from the ground up, without waste, with the precision of someone for whom every number was real. She worked until the overhead light made her eyes ache. Then she read through the full document, all 9 pages now, and made herself sit with the doubt. It was not small doubt. She did not treat it as though it were. She let it occupy the full space it needed, and she looked at it clearly, the way you looked at things in the notebook that were circled and unresolved. The exposure, the risk of attaching herself publicly to anything connected to Bruno Toscano, Victor's specific interest in her as a lever, the possibility of building something real on ground that was, by any ordinary measure, complicated. She thought about Nadia in the service hallway. She thought about the shrug, all its layers, the practiced endurance of it, the quiet devastation underneath. She thought about the women who arrived before dawn and left after dark in buildings like this one across the entire city, who saw everything and were credited with nothing, who kept their own records in their own private ways, and had no one who thought those records were worth anything. She thought about what Victor had assumed she was. She picked up the document and put it in her bag. She found Bruno in his office the following morning. She had not called ahead. She had not asked Manuel for access. She had taken the elevator to the penthouse level with her key card and walked through the service corridor into the main hall and knocked on the open office door with the document under her arm. He looked up from 3 monitors and a city spread below him like a map of everything he had spent 20 years acquiring. She did not wait to be invited in. She crossed the room and set the document on his desk. 9 pages. The budget on the final sheet. Every number exact and annotated and real. I want to use your resources to build something, she said. Not for you. Not for your empire. For them. He looked at her then, fully, with the complete attention he gave to things he considered worth his complete attention. She laid it out the way she had learned to lay things out in his world, clearly, without apology, without softening the edges to make it easier to dismiss. The women who arrived before dawn and left after dark. The ones who knew the layout of every floor, but were never invited to sit on any of them. The ones whose observations had never been treated as worth anything. What she wanted to build, not a charity, not a fund that would fold in 2 years, but a real organization with real structure and real teeth. A placement service. A training program. A legal fund. Emergency housing provision for workers who needed to leave unsafe employment. A reporting network. She told him what she had told Jordan about the notebooks. She told him what she had not told anyone, about the specific, grinding reality of 8 years of seeing things that fell into the gap and stayed there. She told him about Nadia's shrug and what it had contained. She told him about Victor in the lobby. His expression did not change when she said that, but something in the room changed, the specific, pressurized quality of a man absorbing a piece of information and filing it in a place she could not access. You would be exposing yourself, he said carefully. Publicly attaching yourself to anything connected to me carries risk. I know. He was quiet. The city hummed 30 floors below them. She stood on the other side of his desk and did not fill the silence. How much do you need to start? He said. She turned to the final page and slid it forward. He looked at it. She watched him look at it. The precise, rapid assessment of a man who read numbers the way other people read sentences, taking in the whole before returning to the parts. He looked at it for exactly 4 seconds. Done, he said. The word landed in the room with a weight and a simplicity that she had not expected and did not immediately know what to do with. She held it for a moment, just the word and its weight, before she allowed herself to continue. What will you call it? He said. And his voice had shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but at a different register. The one she had heard once before in a kitchen at 3 in the morning, when he had looked at her as though she were something he did not have a prepared response for. She had known the answer to this question for longer than she had known she was thinking about it. The shield, she said. He looked at her across the desk. Something moved through his expression. That slow, almost bewildered recalibration she recognized now. The look of a man for whom the world kept producing things he could not own or direct or predict, and who was, against every expectation, beginning to find that he did not want to. She picked up her bag. Thank you, she said, and meant it in the precise, unadorned way she meant things when she meant them completely. She walked out of his office and back through the penthouse corridor and down through the building's quiet floors, her document signed and her budget approved, and the name of the thing she was building already settling into her chest like the first solid piece of a foundation. The shield. It was time to build. The first office was a rented space in Midtown that smelled of fresh paint and someone else's old carpet. It had a conference table she had found through a second-hand office supplier, 6 mismatched chairs, 2 laptops, a coffee maker that wheezed when it worked and refused to work when it did not, and a window that looked out onto the side wall of the building opposite. It was nothing. It was exactly enough. She signed the lease on a Wednesday morning and stood in the empty room for a while after the property manager left, looking at the dimensions of what she had been given to work with, and felt the same thing she had felt on every first day of every job she had ever taken, the particular, grounding clarity of a beginning. She called Lena Park that afternoon. She had known Lena for 2 years the way you knew people you encountered in the corridors of the same industry, by reputation first, and then by the 3 or 4 conversations that were enough to tell you what someone was made of. Lena had run the housekeeping floor at the Meridian for 6 years, had a business degree she had finished while working double shifts that she had stopped expecting to matter, and had a way of looking at problems that went straight to the structural root of them, without drama or detour. She was precise and direct and had, on one occasion, presented Leisha with a solution to a supply chain problem on their shared contract that was better than anything the building management team had proposed. Leisha told her about the shield, all of it, the placement structure, the training program, the legal fund, the emergency housing provision, the reporting network. She told her about the notebooks and the gap and Nadia in the service hallway. Lena listened without interrupting. Operations director, Leisha said. Equal partner in everything that matters. Your degree, your systems, your judgment. I have the vision and the network. You build the architecture it runs on. A pause. You're serious, Lena said. I don't do anything else. Another pause, shorter. I'll need to see the budget. Leisha sent it before they hung up. Lena called back 40 minutes later and said she had 3 structural suggestions and a question about the legal fund model, and yes, word moved the way it always moved between women in service work, quietly and carefully and person to person through the back corridors and break rooms and service elevators of the city. Not announced, not advertised, passed along in the specific way of information that people who have learned not to trust official channels learn to trust instead. Through recommendation, through the testimony of someone whose judgment you had already tested in other rooms. Within 6 weeks, the Shield had 40 enrolled workers. Within 3 months, 200. Lena built the case management system from scratch and ran it with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting years for a problem that was actually worth solving. Jordan, who had maintained her precise and productive skepticism throughout, became the organization's most reliable informal referral source without ever being asked, simply routing people through her catering network the way she routed everything, through the force of her own considerable judgment. Nadia came in on a Tuesday, in the 2nd month. She sat across from Leisha at the conference table and did not perform either gratitude or resilience, which is exactly what Leisha had expected and exactly why she had asked her. They talked for 2 hours about the structure and the gaps and the specific, particular knowledge that came from having work service jobs in this city for 25 years. Nadia's knee was seen by the end of the month through the Shield's healthcare provision. She never mentioned it. Leisha did not make her. Victor moved in the 4th month. He had been patient, which she had anticipated, and he had been strategic, which she had also anticipated, and he had underestimated her completely, which she had been counting on. His approach came through the organization's placement clients, a quiet pressure applied at the edges, the kind of interference that was designed to look like market friction rather than targeted disruption. 2 client families received calls from a competing service she had not previously heard of, offering arrangements at lower rates. A supplier for their training materials developed a sudden and unspecified problem with their contract. A journalist was pointed toward a story about the Shield's funding structure, a story that was designed to raise questions about the source of the money and the nature of Leisha's relationship to it. She had prepared for all of it. The competing service folded inside 3 weeks when its licensing documentation proved to be incomplete, a fact surfaced by one of the Shield's enrolled workers who had previously cleaned the offices of the shell company behind it and had noted, in the careful, thorough way she noted things, that the licensing paperwork on the wall of the main office had never matched the business name on the door. The journalist received a full, clean audit of the Shield's books from Lena before the story ran. There was nothing to find because there had never been anything to find. Leisha had made certain of that from the first day. The subsidiary company was legitimate. The funding was documented. The organization's books were open to anyone who wanted to read them. Victor's real exposure came from a woman named Celestine, who had worked as a cleaning contractor in his Midtown office building for 4 years, and who had, over the course of those 4 years, kept careful mental records of the things she had observed while moving through rooms that no one thought to guard against her presence in. She had come to the Shield in the 3rd month through a referral from Jordan's network. She had not come with the intention of exposing anyone. She had come because she needed emergency housing provision for a colleague in a hostile employment situation. But she had mentioned, in the thorough intake process Lena had designed, several specific observations about the Midtown office, names of visitors, dates, the contents of documents she had been close enough to read while cleaning a room that was never actually empty of information, simply because it appeared to be empty of people. Leisha had read Celestine's intake file on a Thursday evening and sat very still with it for a long time. Then she had gone to Bruno's office. She did not tell him what to do with the information. She told him what she had and where it had come from, and let him make the calculation she had already made, that the observation of a woman whose presence no one had thought to account for had produced what no investigation had managed to find. He looked at the file for a long time. When he looked up, his expression held the quality she had seen once before in a kitchen at 3 a.m, the slow, almost bewildered recalibration of a man encountering something he could not own or predict. "You built the thing that found him," he said. "We built the thing that found him," she said. "Celestine built the thing that found him. She's been building it for 4 years without knowing what it was for." Victor's position unraveled over the following 3 weeks through channels that had nothing to do with Bruno's power and everything to do with the specific, comprehensive evidence produced by a woman he had never thought to consider. He did not fall to force. He fell to observation, to the quiet, patient accumulation of what the invisible economy saw in the rooms it was trusted to move through precisely because no one had ever thought to wonder what it noticed. She was at the new office when she heard, 3 times the size of the first one, large windows, good light, a coffee maker that actually worked. Lena told her with the contained satisfaction of someone for whom justice was also a logistics problem that had been correctly solved. Leisha nodded and went back to the intake files on her desk. That evening, Bruno came home to find her research notes spread across the kitchen table and 2 cups of tea already made. She stood in the doorway and looked at him sitting there, this dangerous and complicated man with scarred hands and a city below his windows, reading her case files with the careful attention of someone who wanted to understand what she was building. "You read my files," she said. "I wanted to understand," he said. He looked up. Something in his face was different in the way it had been slowly becoming different for months. The cold calculation still present because it was built into him, and she understood that now. But underneath it, the thing she had watched grow since a kitchen at 3 a.m, the quiet, grounded wonder of a man who had spent 20 years believing power meant control, sitting across from evidence that it did not. "You're doing what I spent 20 years trying to do," he said, "making people safe, except yours will last." She sat down and wrapped her hands around her tea. "That's because I'm not the power," she said. "They are. I just gave them a table." He reached across and covered her hands with his. Neither of them said anything. The city glittered. The tea went warm. The quiet between them held the specific, settled quality of 2 people who had learned to see each other clearly and had decided, without drama or declaration, that this was enough and more than enough. She had 14 women coming in the morning. She thought about them as she sat there, imagining the careful interview clothes and the folders held in both hands, and the bone-deep tiredness of years of being unseen. She thought about every version of herself she had ever been, the safety pins, the $63, the girl who moved through glittering rooms and was looked through as if she were made of glass. She was ready for them. In the morning, she would pull out a chair. She would tell them there was coffee, and they did not need to ask permission. She would tell them what someone should have told her a long time ago. She would tell them they were not invisible here, and they never would be again. "Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it.